Owen exhaled sharply, shifting his weight from one foot to the other as he glanced at the checkout line ahead. He had been standing there for what felt like an eternity, the fluorescent grocery store lights buzzing faintly above him. His cart wasn't even full, just a few essentials: milk, bread, a six-pack of beer he probably didn't need, and a frozen meal he'd regret later. The woman in front of him seemed flustered, digging through her purse with frantic hands as the cashier waited patiently. Owen could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers trembled slightly as she searched. Just give me one more second," she murmured, her voice tight with embarrassment. Owen's chest tightened. He'd been in that position before, standing in front of strangers while panic set in, knowing you were holding up the line, feeling the weight of impatient stares pressing down on you. Without thinking, he stepped forward. "Here," he said, offering a small smile as he pushed his cart back. "Go ahead. Take my spot." The woman's head snapped up, her wide brown eyes locking onto his. For a second, she just stared at him, clearly taken aback. "Oh, I thank you," she said, exhaling in relief. Owen nodded, stepping aside as she shuffled forward. A few minutes later, she managed to find her card, and the transaction went through. She turned back to him, clutching her bag of groceries against her chest. "That was really kind of you," she said. "You didn't have to do that." "Not a big deal," Owen said, shrugging. "I wasn't in a rush." She hesitated, then offered him a small, grateful smile. "Well, thanks, anyway. I'm Noelle." Owen hadn't been expecting her to introduce herself, but something about the way she said it made his stomach tighten in a way he didn't quite understand. "Owen." Noelle nodded, then glanced at the exit. "I should go, but have a good night." "Yeah. You too." She turned and walked away, but for some reason Owen found himself watching her go. He wasn't the kind of guy who believed in fate or signs or any of that nonsense, but there was something about her, something that lingered in his mind long after she disappeared out the door. Owen shook his head and forced himself to focus. It was just a small moment, nothing more. At least, that's what he thought. The next time he saw Noelle, it was purely by accident. It had been a long day at work, and Owen had stopped by a small cafe near his apartment to grab a coffee. He'd been staring at his phone, scrolling mindlessly, when he heard a familiar voice behind him. "No way." He turned, and there she was, Noelle. She was holding a to-go cup, her brown eyes filled with the same warmth he remembered from the grocery store. "You again," he said, a slow grin tugging at his lips. She laughed, shaking her head. "Guess I owe you another thank you. That night at the store? You saved me from a complete meltdown." He chuckled. "I doubt it was that dramatic." "Oh, it was," she insisted. "I had the worst day, my card was acting up, and then you—" She stopped, biting her lip. "Anyway, it meant a lot." Owen studied her for a moment. There was something so effortlessly genuine about her, something that made it impossible to look away. "Let me make it up to you," she said suddenly. He raised an eyebrow. "Make what up?" "The favor. You let me go ahead of you in line. Least I can do is buy you a coffee." Owen hesitated. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected her. But before he could overthink it, he found himself nodding. "All right," he said. "I'll take you up on that." Noelle beamed. "Good choice." As she stepped up to the counter to order for him, Owen exhaled, running a hand through his hair. Maybe that moment in the grocery store hadn't been so small after all. Owen hadn't expected a simple coffee to turn into something more. But somehow, it did. He and Noelle ended up at a small table near the cafe's window, the city lights flickering outside as people hurried past on the sidewalk. What was supposed to be a quick exchange, a thank you coffee, and nothing more, had stretched into something that neither of them seemed eager to end. "So," Noelle said, stirring her drink absent-mindedly, "tell me something unexpected about you." Owen lifted a brow. "Unexpected?" "Yeah," she said, leaning forward slightly. "Something people wouldn't guess just by looking at you." He considered that for a moment, tapping his fingers against the side of his cup. "I used to play the violin." Her eyes widened, the corners of her lips lifting in surprise. "No way." "Yeah," he said, shaking his head. "I was terrible at it." She laughed, the sound light and unguarded. "How long did you stick with it?" "Too long," he admitted. "My mom signed me up for lessons when I was a kid. I think she hoped I'd be some kind of prodigy, but it turns out I have the musical talent of a rock." Noelle grinned, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "That's still pretty cool, though." Even if you were terrible. What about you? Owen asked, tilting his head. What's something unexpected about you? She hesitated as if debating whether to answer honestly. Then, with a small, almost sheepish smile, she said, I hate the sound of applause. Owen blinked. Applause? Yeah, she said, wrapping her hands around her cup. I don't know what it is, but it makes my skin crawl. The loud, chaotic clapping? It just ugh. She shuddered slightly. I used to do theater in high school, and every time the audience clapped at the end of a show, I had to fight the urge to run off stage. He chuckled. That's definitely unexpected. Told you, she said, nudging her drink toward him as if to emphasize her point. The conversation flowed easily after that, moving from one topic to the next with a kind of effortless rhythm that Owen wasn't used to. He'd never been one for small talk, but with Noelle, nothing felt forced. She had this way of making even the most ordinary subjects feel interesting, her expressions shifting with every word, her laughter breaking through the quiet hum of the cafe. At some point, Owen glanced at his watch and realized they'd been sitting there for nearly 2 hours. I should probably let you go, he said reluctantly. I didn't mean to hold you hostage all night. Noelle shook her head. I don't mind. Honestly, this is the most fun I've had in a while. That admission did something to him, something he wasn't ready to examine too closely. Outside, the air had turned crisp, the kind of autumn chill that hinted at the coming winter. They stood near the curb, neither of them moving to leave just yet. This was nice, Noelle said, rocking back on her heels slightly. I'm glad we ran into each other again. Owen nodded. Me too. For a brief second, he considered asking for her number. But before he could open his mouth, Noelle exhaled and glanced toward the street. Well, she said, stuffing her hands into her jacket pockets. I guess I'll see you around? There was something uncertain in her tone, as if she wasn't sure if this was the kind of thing that would happen again or if this was just a fleeting moment between two strangers. Owen didn't want it to be fleeting. Yeah, he said. See you around. She lingered for half a beat longer, then gave him a small wave before turning to walk down the sidewalk. Owen watched her go, something unfamiliar twisting in his chest. Maybe he should have asked. Maybe he still could. But instead, he let her disappear into the night, telling himself that if fate had brought them together twice, maybe just maybe it would happen again. Owen hadn't expected to run into Noelle again so soon. It had been a few days since their impromptu coffee conversation, and he'd caught himself thinking about her more than he cared to admit. There was something about the way she spoke, the way she listened, the way her presence made the air feel lighter, as if she carried warmth with her wherever she went. He told himself it was just a passing thought, nothing significant. But when he spotted her again, standing outside a bookstore as she adjusted the strap of her bag, his pulse quickened before he could stop it. She hadn't seen him yet. She was skimming her fingers over the spines of a display rack, her focus lost in the selection of books, her lips slightly parted as if she were reading the titles silently to herself. For a moment, he considered walking past, letting the universe decide if fate would push them together again. But then, before he could give himself time to overthink, he stepped toward her. Find anything good? His voice was casual, but his heart pounded in a way that was anything but. Noelle turned, her eyes widening in surprise before recognition softened her expression. Owen, she said, as if tasting the sound of his name again. What are the odds? Apparently higher than I thought, he admitted. You come here often? More than I should, she said, tapping the edge of a hardcover book. I tell myself I'll just browse. But then I walk out with 3 new novels and no self-control. Owen chuckled. A dangerous habit. The most dangerous, she agreed, her grin tilting toward something playful. There was something easy about this, about the way they fell into conversation as if they weren't two people who had only met days ago. It wasn't forced, wasn't awkward. It was just natural. Noelle tilted her head slightly, studying him. What about you? Are you the type to get lost in a bookstore? Not exactly, he admitted. I read, but I wouldn't say I lose track of time in places like this. She crossed her arms, raising an eyebrow. Let me guess. Non-fiction? Mostly, he said. You sound disappointed. I'm not, she said, though her tone suggested otherwise. I just think you're missing out. Owen leaned against the display shelf. You gonna convince me otherwise? A challenge flickered in her gaze. Without hesitation, she reached for a book and placed it in his hands. This, she said, tapping the cover, will change your mind. He glanced down at the title. It wasn't something he would have picked for himself, but the way she looked at him, expectant and amused, made it impossible to refuse. "You really believe that?" he asked. "I do," she said, her confidence unwavering. Owen exhaled, then flipped the book over, skimming the synopsis before nodding. "All right, I'll give it a shot." Noelle clapped her hands together, looking victorious. "Good. Now I won't judge you for your nonfiction habit." He shook his head, amused despite himself. "I didn't realize I needed redemption." "You always need redemption when your reading choices are boring," she teased. Owen found himself grinning. She had a way of making everything feel light, like the weight of the world lessened in her presence. A sudden gust of wind swept through the street, rustling the pages of the open books on display. Noelle shivered slightly, pulling her jacket tighter around her. "Cold?" he asked. "A little," she admitted. Without thinking, he shrugged off his jacket and draped it over her shoulders. Noelle blinked, caught off guard. "You didn't have to do that." "I know," he said simply. She hesitated for a beat, then adjusted the jacket around herself, her fingers gripping the fabric as if she were testing its warmth. "You're full of surprises, Owen." He wasn't sure what to say to that, so he just watched as she shifted on her feet, glancing at him as if she were weighing a thought. "Do you want to grab something warm?" she asked finally. "There's a little cafe down the street. I hear they have the best hot chocolate in the city." Owen didn't hesitate. "Lead the way." And just like that, they walked side by side, the space between them smaller than before, the air humming with something unspoken. Something neither of them seemed ready to name just yet. Owen had never been one to believe in signs, but as he sat across from Noelle in the quiet warmth of the cafe, he couldn't shake the feeling that their paths had crossed for a reason. The scent of cocoa and cinnamon lingered in the air, the steam from their drinks curling between them as they settled into the small corner booth. Outside, the city had softened into evening, the streetlights casting a muted glow over the sidewalks. Noelle wrapped her hands around her mug, her fingers tracing the rim absent-mindedly. "You ever just end up somewhere you didn't expect to be?" Owen lifted an eyebrow. "Like physically or metaphorically?" She laughed lightly. "Either." He considered her question, leaning back against the worn leather seat. "Yeah, more than I'd like to admit." She tilted her head, curiosity flickering in her eyes. "What's one of those times?" Owen hesitated, not because he didn't have an answer, but because he wasn't sure how much to give away. But something about Noelle made honesty feel effortless. "My job," he said finally. "I never planned to do what I'm doing now. Thought I'd end up somewhere else entirely." Her gaze sharpened. "Where did you think you'd be?" He exhaled, staring into his coffee as if it could tell him. "When I was younger, I wanted to be a firefighter." Her eyebrows lifted. "Really?" He nodded. "It seemed like the kind of job that mattered, you know? Something where you knew, without a doubt, that you were making a difference." Her expression softened. "And what changed?" "Life," he said simply. "Things happen. You adjust. One day you wake up and realize you're on a completely different path than the one you imagined." Noelle was quiet for a moment, studying him as if she were seeing something beyond his words. Then, with a small smile, she said, "You might not have ended up where you expected, but that doesn't mean you're not making a difference." Owen wasn't sure why that hit him the way it did, but before he could respond, she shifted in her seat, resting her chin on her hand. "You know, I kind of get it," she admitted. He leaned in slightly. "Yeah?" She nodded. "I used to think I'd be a musician." Owen blinked. "A musician?" "Yeah," she said, her lips quirking up. "I played piano for years. Thought I'd make a career out of it." "What happened?" She hesitated, her fingers tightening around her mug. "I lost my nerve." Owen frowned. "What do you mean?" She let out a breath as if pushing past something uncomfortable. "I loved playing, but I hated performing. Every time I got on stage, I felt like I couldn't breathe. It got to the point where I started dreading it, and eventually I just stopped." Owen watched her carefully, sensing the weight behind her words. "Do you miss it?" Her gaze flickered as if she hadn't allowed herself to consider that question in a long time. "Sometimes," she admitted, "but I don't know if I could ever go back to it. Not the way I used to." He studied her for a moment, then said, "You don't have to play for an audience to still love it." She looked at him then, really looked at him, as if his words had landed somewhere deep. Before she could respond, the barista called out an order, breaking the quiet between them. Noelle blinked, then exhaled, shaking off whatever thought had just passed through her. I think you're the first person who's ever said that to me, she murmured half to herself. Owen didn't know what to say to that, so he just held her gaze, letting the silence stretch between them in a way that didn't feel awkward, just full. Eventually, Noelle glanced at the time and sighed. I should probably head out. Owen nodded, though he wasn't eager to see the night end. They left the cafe together, stepping out into the cool night air. The wind had picked up, rustling the leaves along the pavement. Noelle turned to him, adjusting the strap of her purse. This was nice. Yeah, he said, his voice quieter than before. It was. She hesitated for a moment as if debating something. Then, with a small smile, she said, I'll see you around, Owen. For the second time, she walked away before he could ask for her number, before he could find a reason to make sure this wasn't just another fleeting moment. But as he watched her disappear into the night, something in his gut told him this wasn't over. Not yet. Owen had been trying to convince himself that Noelle was just another person he happened to meet, a fleeting connection that didn't mean anything in the grand scheme of things. But that was a lie. He knew at the moment he saw her again. It was another ordinary evening, the kind that passed without much thought. He had just left work and decided to stop by the park, something he did occasionally when he wasn't ready to go home just yet. The air was crisp, the scent of fallen leaves mixing with the distant hum of city noise. And then, as if the universe was playing some kind of game with him, there she was. Noelle sat on one of the benches near the fountain, her posture relaxed but her expression distant. She was staring down at something, in her hands a notebook, its pages fluttering slightly in the breeze. Owen hadn't planned on interrupting, but there was no hesitation as his feet moved toward her. She didn't notice him at first, too lost in whatever thoughts were occupying her mind. But when he was a few steps away, she looked up and her eyes widened briefly before a slow, genuine smile took over her face. You again, she said, closing the notebook. Owen let out a short laugh. At this point, I'm starting to think you're following me. She tilted her head, amusement flickering in her gaze. Funny, I was about to say the same about you. He nodded toward the notebook in her lap. What are you working on? Noelle hesitated, her fingers brushing over the worn cover. Nothing really. Just thoughts. He could tell she was holding back, but he didn't push. Instead, he sat down beside her, leaving just enough space between them to feel the cool evening air. I don't usually come here, she admitted after a beat. But today I needed to clear my head. Owen glanced over at her. Something on your mind? She exhaled, resting the notebook on her knee. I got an invitation today. From an old friend. He waited, sensing there was more. They want me to play again. Just one night, nothing big, she continued, her voice quieter now. And I don't know why, but it's messing with me. Owen studied her, watching the way her fingers curled slightly against the edge of the notebook. Because you miss it? She was quiet for a long moment before she finally admitted, because I don't know if I can do it. There was something raw in her voice, something that made Owen want to tell her that she could. That she should. That whatever fear was holding her back, it wasn't stronger than the part of her that still loved it. But he knew that wasn't his place, it had to be her choice. Do you want to? He asked instead. Noelle looked over at him, her expression unreadable. I don't know. The silence between them stretched, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was thoughtful, weighted with something unspoken. Eventually, she shook her head and let out a soft laugh. I didn't mean to dump all of this on you. She stopped, then smiled in a way that didn't quite reach her eyes. It's funny. I barely know you, but somehow talking to you feels easy. Owen felt something tighten in his chest at that. He wanted to tell her that he understood, that he felt the same way. That it had been a long time since someone had made him feel like just being there, just listening was enough. But instead he said, maybe that's a sign. She raised an eyebrow. A sign of what? That you should play, he said simply. Noelle let out a breath, shaking her head, but she didn't argue. And for the first time since sitting down, Owen saw a flicker of something in her expression, something that looked a lot like hope. They sat there for a while, wrapped in the quiet of the park, neither of them in a hurry to leave. And for the first time in a long time, Owen wasn't thinking about what came next. He was just here, with her. And somehow that felt like enough. The night of the performance arrived faster than either of them expected. Owen stood near the back of the small venue, his hands tucked into his pockets as he scanned the dimly lit stage. The place had a quiet intimacy about it, the kind of setting where every note carried weight, where every moment felt personal. He could see the piano, polished and waiting, its keys gleaming under the soft glow of hanging bulbs. Noelle was backstage. He hadn't seen her yet, but he didn't need to. He could feel the tension in the air, the anticipation buzzing around the room. People murmured in hushed excitement, waiting for the music to begin. Owen exhaled, his chest tightening slightly. He had no idea if she would go through with it. She hadn't said much the last time they talked about it, just that she was still thinking. But he had seen something shift in her expression that night in the park. Something uncertain, but hopeful. And now he was here, waiting. Then, the lights dimmed further, and the murmurs died down. A single spotlight illuminated the stage, and Noelle stepped into it. Owen's breath caught. She looked different up there, not just beautiful, but composed. Her posture straight even as her hands trembled at her sides. Her dark dress moved slightly as she walked, fabric catching the light as she made her way toward the piano. The room was silent. Noelle hesitated, just for a second. Then, she sat down, placing her fingers on the keys. For a moment, there was nothing. Just stillness. Then she played. The first notes rang out, delicate but deliberate, filling the space with something that made Owen's chest tighten. It was soft at first, hesitant, like she was testing the waters, but then something changed. The melody deepened, rich and full, the kind of sound that wrapped itself around you, refusing to let go. Owen could see it happening, the way her body relaxed, the way her fingers moved with more confidence, as if the music had reached out and pulled her into its current. She wasn't just playing. She was feeling. Owen swallowed hard, his throat tight. He barely realized he had stepped closer, drawn forward by something beyond himself. The way she played, the way her expression shifted as she lost herself in the music, it was breathtaking. It was fearless. And then it was over. The final note lingered in the air, suspended for a moment before fading into silence. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then applause erupted. Noelle flinched slightly at the sound, but then something unexpected happened. She smiled. A real, unguarded smile. And Owen knew. She had done it. As the clapping continued, Noelle stood, giving a small nod before stepping off the stage. Owen didn't hesitate. He moved through the crowd, weaving past tables and people still murmuring about her performance until he reached the side door leading backstage. He found her there, leaning against the wall, her hands still trembling slightly. He could see the way she was breathing deeply, as if trying to steady herself. When she looked up and saw him, something in her eyes softened. "You did it," Owen said, his voice quieter than he expected. Noelle let out something between a laugh and a breath. "I did." He stepped closer, close enough to see the lingering adrenaline in her expression, the way her fingers still curled slightly as if they were remembering the keys beneath them. "You were incredible," he said, and he meant it. She let out a shaky breath, her smile turning wistful. "I was terrified, but you still did it." She nodded, and for a moment, they just stood there, the space between them charged with something fragile but undeniable. Then, before he could stop himself, Owen reached out, his fingers brushing against hers. Not forceful, not overwhelming, just a touch, just enough to let her know he was there. Noelle didn't pull away. Instead, she exhaled, looking up at him in a way that made the air between them feel impossibly small. "I think," she said softly, "that I was supposed to meet you." Owen's breath hitched, because he felt the same. He didn't think. He knew. And so, he did the only thing that made sense. He stepped even closer, his hand moving to gently cup her face, his thumb brushing against her cheek. Noelle's breath shuddered, but she didn't move away. If anything, she leaned into him, her body gravitating toward his like it was the most natural thing in the world. Owen didn't wait. He kissed her. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't frantic. It was steady, deep, filled with everything neither of them had said but had felt all along. And when they finally pulled back, breathless, Noelle let out a quiet laugh, her forehead resting against his. "I think I was supposed to meet you, too," Owen murmured. She smiled. And just like that, neither of them had to wonder anymore. Because this was exactly where they were meant to be.